The air inside the dimly lit auction house was thick with the scent of old wood and varnish. Amber Doyle sat in the back row, a catalog clutched tightly in her hands. A self-proclaimed art enthusiast and rising collector, Amber had spent years scouring estate sales and galleries for unique pieces. Tonight, a rare auction of 19th-century works had drawn her here, and one piece in particular had caught her eye. Lot 43, an unnamed portrait by an obscure artist. Amber didn't know why the painting had captivated her so completely. The catalog's small black and white photograph showed a man in an antiquated suit, his sharp eyes seeming to pierce through the page. Something about the expression, a mix of smugness and melancholy, had sent a chill down her spine. Yet, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The auctioneer's hammer struck, snapping her out of her reverie. Lot 43, a 19th-century portrait, artist unknown, origin France. Starting bid at $500. Amber raised her paddle before she even realized it. The auctioneer's sharp voice continued. 600. Do I hear 7? Another bidder, a stern-looking woman in the front row, raised her paddle. 700. 8. Amber hesitated for a moment, her heart racing. The painting wasn't particularly famous or valuable. Why was she so compelled? Ignoring the doubts bubbling in her mind, she lifted her paddle higher. 900, the auctioneer announced. 1,000. The woman up front turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Amber. There was something cold and calculating in her gaze, as though she were warning Amber to stop. But Amber refused to back down. $1,000, she declared, her voice steady. A long pause followed. The woman in the front row hesitated, then slowly lowered her paddle. Sold. To the lady in the back. Amber exhaled, her excitement tempered by the strange unease that prickled at the back of her neck. She had won. But as she stared at the portrait being carried off the stage, she couldn't shake the sensation that she had just made a mistake. 2 days later, the painting arrived at Amber's loft. Her space was minimalist, filled with crisp white walls and strategically placed spotlights to display her collection. The portrait, however, disrupted the room's aesthetic entirely. The gilded frame was chipped and tarnished, the canvas faded with age. But it was the figure in the painting that unnerved her the most. Up close, the man's face appeared even more unsettling. His dark, shadowed eyes seemed alive, their intensity unyielding. The faint smirk on his lips felt mocking, as though he knew a secret she didn't. Amber shook off her discomfort, telling herself she was being irrational. She hung the portrait in a corner of the room, away from her other prized pieces. That night, she dreamed of the man in the painting. In her dream, he was standing at the foot of her bed, his head tilted slightly as though studying her. When she tried to move, she found herself paralyzed, unable to scream as his face drew closer. She awoke with a gasp, her heart pounding. "It's just a painting," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The following evening, as she worked on her laptop in the living room, a faint sound drew her attention. It was soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper carried on the wind. She paused, straining to hear it. It was coming from the direction of the painting. Amber's pulse quickened. She stood slowly, her bare feet making no sound against the hardwood floor. As she approached the portrait, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't in English, or at least not any version of it she recognized. The words were guttural, almost melodic, as though part of an ancient chant. She stared at the painting, her breath shallow. The man's expression seemed different now. The smirk was gone, replaced by a look of quiet menace. His eyes, had they shifted? Were they following her movements? Amber backed away, shaking her head. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. She grabbed her phone and called her best friend, Sophie. "You sound freaked out," Sophie said after Amber explained the situation. "It's probably just your imagination." "Maybe," Amber replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Get some sleep," Sophie urged. "You're probably overthinking it." Amber hung up, resolving to do just that. But as she walked back toward her bedroom, she couldn't resist one last glance at the portrait. She froze. The man's hand, previously resting on his lap, was now raised, his fingers pointing directly at her. Amber stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She blinked rapidly, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. She told herself it couldn't be real. Paintings didn't move. And yet, the man's finger was unmistakably extended, pointing toward her like an accusation. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the room with its haunting cadence. Amber's heart thundered in her chest as she backed away. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, closing in around her. Then, with a sudden, deafening crack, the painting fell from the wall. Amber screamed, the sound echoing through the empty loft. As she stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, she realized something horrifying. The figure in the painting was gone. The canvas was empty, and the whispering, it was now coming from directly behind her. Amber's breath caught in her throat as she spun around. The room behind her was empty, the shadows playing tricks under the dim light. But the whispering persisted, growing louder, more insistent. It filled her ears, reverberating through her skull like an ancient chant clawing its way into her mind. Her eyes darted to the fallen portrait. The ornate frame was twisted slightly from the impact, but the canvas was horrifyingly blank. The figure that had so haunted her, his intense gaze, that sinister smirk, was gone, leaving only a blank, cracked surface. Amber took a hesitant step forward, her bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. "Stop it," she muttered, her voice trembling. "You're imagining things." The whispering ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. It was so sudden, so complete, that her ears rang in protest. For a moment, she thought perhaps she had imagined it all: stress, lack of sleep, maybe even the leftover adrenaline from the auction house drama. But as she leaned down to inspect the painting, she noticed something chilling. A faint, oily handprint had appeared on the blank canvas. Amber stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of her coffee table. The handprint was too vivid, too precise to be an accident. 5 long fingers splayed across the canvas, as though someone or something had reached out from within. Her phone buzzed on the table, jolting her out of her paralysis. She grabbed it with shaking hands and saw Sophie's name flashing on the screen. "Amber." Sophie's voice was calm but edged with concern. "I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what you said earlier. Are you okay?" "No," Amber whispered, clutching the phone as though it could protect her. "Sophie, it moved. The painting, it moved. And now it's—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "It's empty. The man is gone." There was a pause. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "I don't know how to explain it," Amber said, her words tumbling out. "It's like he left the painting. There's this handprint now, and—" A loud bang cut her off, the sound echoing through the loft like a gunshot. Amber screamed, nearly dropping the phone. "What was that?" Sophie's voice was sharp. "Amber, what's happening?" Amber's eyes darted around the room, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear her friend. The source of the sound became clear as her gaze landed on the far corner of the loft. A chair had tipped over, lying on its side as if someone had forcefully shoved it. I don't know," Amber stammered. "It's like someone's here, but I can't see them." "Get out of the house," Sophie urged. "Just leave. Come to my place." Amber hesitated. The idea of fleeing her own home felt absurd. But the oppressive sense of being watched was unbearable, and her rational mind was quickly unraveling. She grabbed her coat and keys, pausing only to glance back at the painting. The handprint on the canvas seemed darker now, the edges shimmering faintly in the dim light. The longer she stared, the more it seemed to pulse, as though alive. The whispering returned. "Amber!" Sophie shouted through the phone, snapping her back to reality. "Get out of there!" Amber bolted for the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As she fumbled with the lock, the lights in the loft flickered violently, plunging the room into alternating moments of blinding brightness and suffocating darkness. Finally, the door gave way, and Amber stumbled into the hallway. She didn't stop to look back. Sophie's apartment was a stark contrast to Amber's loft. Warm, cozy, and filled with the scent of lavender candles. But despite the safety of her friend's home, Amber couldn't stop glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the figure from the portrait to materialize in the shadows. "Start from the beginning," Sophie said, placing a mug of tea in front of her. "What's going on with this painting?" Amber recounted everything, from the strange pull she'd felt at the auction to the whispers and the figure's disappearance. Sophie listened intently, her face a mask of skepticism and concern. "You really think the painting is haunted?" Sophie asked carefully. Amber nodded, her hands trembling as she held the mug. "I know how it sounds, but you didn't see it. You didn't feel it." Sophie leaned back, her brow furrowed. "Maybe we should look into it. See if there's a history behind the painting." Amber hesitated. "Do you think that'll help?" "It can't hurt," Sophie said. "I'll start digging. In the meantime, you're not going back to that loft alone." The next day, Sophie dove into her investigation. She scoured online forums, antique dealer records, and art history databases, searching for any mention of the mysterious portrait. What she found was sparse but deeply unsettling. The painting, it seemed, had a history of misfortune. Its previous owners were plagued by strange phenomena, unexplained accidents, whispers in the night, and, in one case, a fatal fire that destroyed an entire wing of a gallery. There were rumors that the artist, an obscure French painter named Émile Deschamps, had dabbled in the occult. Some claimed he used human blood to mix his paints, while others believed he had trapped a part of his own soul within the canvas. "This guy was bad news," Sophie said, showing Amber her findings. "If half of this is true, we're dealing with something seriously dark." Amber stared at the screen, her stomach churning. "What do I do? Burn it?" Sophie shook her head. "If it really is cursed, destroying it might make things worse. We need to figure out what it wants." Amber felt a chill run down her spine. "What he wants," she corrected. "It's not just the painting. It's him." That night, Amber and Sophie decided to return to the loft together. Armed with flashlights, salt, and a hastily Googled list of protection rituals, they stepped into the darkened space. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as though the loft itself was alive and waiting. The painting lay on the floor where Amber had left it. The handprint was still there, but now it seemed larger, more defined. The edges gleamed faintly in the dim light, as though freshly painted. Amber knelt down, her hands shaking. "What do we do now?" Before Sophie could answer, the loft's temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the icy air. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the room with its eerie cadence. And then, slowly, the figure began to reappear on the canvas. First, the outline of the face took shape, followed by the piercing eyes and that malevolent smirk. Amber and Sophie watched in horror as the painted man turned his head, his gaze locking onto Amber. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deep, resonant voice that seemed to echo from the very walls. "You brought me here," it said. "Now you must finish what you started." The voice's chilling resonance echoed in Amber's mind long after it had faded. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like a command, reverberating through her bones and compelling her to stay rooted to the spot. Beside her, Sophie clutched her flashlight tightly, her face pale and unreadable in the dim light of the loft. "Amber," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Did he just talk?" Amber nodded slowly, unable to tear her gaze away from the portrait. The figure in the painting, now fully formed again, stood out starkly against the dark, cracked canvas. His eyes seemed to follow her every movement, brimming with an unnatural, malevolent intelligence. "What do you want?" Amber managed to croak, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. The room was silent for a moment, heavy with anticipation. Then, the voice returned, low and measured, each word laced with a sinister promise. "You invited me in. You know what must be done." Amber felt her knees weaken, and she braced herself against the wall for support. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" The painted figure didn't move, but his eyes seemed to burn brighter. A shadow began to creep out from the edges of the frame, dark tendrils snaking across the floor toward Amber and Sophie. "Okay, we're done," Sophie said suddenly, snapping out of her daze. She grabbed Amber's arm and tugged her toward the door. "We're leaving. Now." But the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the lock twisting itself into place. Amber let out a strangled cry, pulling futilely at the handle. The tendrils of shadow continued to creep closer, their movement deliberate and unnatural, like ink spreading across a page. "Amber!" Sophie shouted, trying to shake her out of her stupor. "Salt. Use the salt." Amber blinked, her mind racing. She fumbled in her coat pocket, pulling out the small pouch of salt they had brought. Her hands shook as she poured a shaky line across the floor between them and the advancing shadows. The effect was immediate. The tendrils recoiled, writhing and hissing as though burned. The voice chuckled darkly. "You think that will stop me?" The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. When they came back on, the painting was no longer on the floor. It hung on the wall directly in front of them, pristine and unblemished, as if it had never fallen. Amber and Sophie exchanged a panicked glance. "We can't stay here," Sophie said, her voice firm despite the terror in her eyes. "We need to figure out what he means, what he wants. Somewhere safe. Let's go." This time, the door yielded under their combined effort, swinging open to reveal the cold night beyond. They didn't look back as they fled down the hallway and into the street, the oppressive weight of the loft lifting slightly with each step. Amber and Sophie sat in Sophie's car, their breaths fogging up the windows as they tried to process what had just happened. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound, a small comfort in the otherwise suffocating silence. "We need help," Amber said finally, her voice hoarse. "I don't think we can deal with this on our own." Sophie nodded, pulling out her phone. "There has to be someone. An expert, a paranormal investigator, something." They spent the next hour scouring online forums and websites, searching for anyone who might have answers. Most of what they found was either too vague or blatantly fraudulent. But one name kept appearing in the forums. Professor Elliot Crane, a historian and occult researcher who had reportedly dealt with similar cases. "This guy looks legit," Sophie said, showing Amber a profile photo of a middle-aged man with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. "He specializes in cursed artifacts and haunted objects." Amber hesitated. "Do you really think he'll believe us?" Sophie shrugged. "At this point, we don't have much choice." The next morning, they arrived at Professor Crane's office, a cluttered space filled with books, artifacts, and peculiar trinkets. Crane himself was as sharp and precise as his online photo suggested. He listened intently as Amber recounted her experience, his expression growing darker with each detail. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "This isn't the first time I've heard of Desham's work," he said. "The man was a painter, yes, but also a practitioner of dark arts. He believed he could achieve immortality by binding fragments of his soul into his creations. Most of his paintings were destroyed, but a few survived, and those who come into contact with them rarely escape unscathed." Amber felt a chill run down her spine. "So, what does he want from me?" Crane's gaze was piercing. "Control. He needs a vessel, someone to anchor him fully in this world. By acquiring the painting, you've already forged a connection. The more you interact with it, the stronger his hold becomes." "What can we do?" Sophie asked, her voice desperate. Crane sighed. "There's a ritual. Dangerous, but it might sever the connection and banish him for good. But you'll need the painting, and whatever is bound within it will not go quietly." Amber's stomach churned. The thought of returning to the loft made her skin crawl, but she knew there was no other option. "What do we need for the ritual?" Crane pulled out a list of items. Candles, a ceremonial dagger, and a specific incantation written in an old, nearly forgotten dialect. "Gather these, and we'll meet at your loft tonight. Once we begin, there's no turning back." By nightfall, Amber, Sophie, and Crane stood outside the loft, their supplies packed tightly into a worn leather bag. Amber's hands trembled as she unlocked the door, the oppressive atmosphere immediately engulfing them. The painting was exactly where they had left it, hanging on the wall as if mocking them. The shadows in the room seemed to writhe and shift, growing darker and more tangible with each passing moment. Crane set up the ritual circle, his movements precise and practiced. "Once we start, you must not step outside the circle," he warned. "No matter what you see or hear." Amber and Sophie nodded, their fear palpable but overshadowed by determination. As Crane began the incantation, the temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows thickened, swirling around the painting like a vortex. The figure in the portrait began to move again, his expression twisting into one of rage. "You dare defy me?" the voice roared, shaking the walls. The shadows lashed out, striking against the protective circle and recoiling with a hiss. Amber gripped Sophie's hand tightly, her heart racing. The figure's eyes locked onto hers, burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce her very soul. "This isn't over," it growled, its voice reverberating in her skull. The shadows surged, and the room erupted into chaos. The room crackled with an electric tension as Crane chanted, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. Amber and Sophie crouched within the protective circle, clutching each other tightly as the shadows writhed and lashed against the barrier. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of burning candles and an unnatural chill that bit into their skin. The painting glowed with an eerie, pulsing light. The figure within it twisted and moved, his expression flickering between rage and triumph. "You cannot sever what is bound," the voice roared, its deep timbre vibrating through the walls. Amber's resolve wavered as she felt the figure's eyes bore into her. The weight of his gaze was suffocating, his malice a tangible force. "Crane, is this supposed to happen?" she shouted over the noise. Crane didn't answer immediately. His focus was unyielding, his voice rising as he recited the incantation. The shadows pushed harder against the circle, cracks forming in the faint light that surrounded them. "Stay inside the circle," he barked, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Do not break the line." The shadows' movements grew more frenzied, each strike against the barrier sending shivers of energy through the room. Sophie gasped as a tendril of darkness snaked closer, brushing against the edge of the salt line and hissing as it recoiled. "It's not holding," Sophie cried, panic edging into her voice. Crane's chanting grew louder, the cadence of his words speeding up. He reached into his bag, pulling out a small vial of red liquid and pouring it over the ceremonial dagger. The blade gleamed as the liquid absorbed into the metal, glowing faintly in the dim light. "We're almost there," Crane shouted. "Amber, when I tell you, you must face the painting and call his name. It's the final step." Amber's heart pounded. "Call his name? How am I supposed to know?" "You know it," Crane interrupted, his voice fierce. "He's been whispering it to you this entire time." Amber's mind raced, fragments of half-heard whispers and eerie dreams surfacing in her memory. A single name floated to the forefront, heavy with dread. "Desham," she whispered to herself, testing the weight of it. Suddenly, the shadows surged, their force doubling as they slammed against the circle. The candles flickered, and one extinguished entirely, leaving a gap in the protective barrier. The room seemed to inhale, a chilling stillness descending before the shadows poured through the breach. "Amber, now!" Crane shouted, thrusting the dagger toward her. Amber took the dagger, its hilt cold and foreign in her hand. With every ounce of courage she could muster, she turned to face the painting. The figure within it sneered, his features warping grotesquely as the shadows writhed around him. "Desham!" Amber screamed, her voice cracking. "I know your name. I banish you." Before she could finish, the figure erupted from the canvas, a torrent of black smoke spiraling into the room. The painting crumbled to ash, its remnants scattering across the floor. Desham's form coalesced in the center of the room, a towering shadow with burning eyes. "You dare invoke my name," he bellowed, his voice a thunderous roar. Amber stumbled backward, her grip tightening on the dagger. Crane rushed forward, positioning himself between her and the apparition. "Finish the incantation," he commanded, his voice urgent. Amber's hands shook as she recited the words Crane had taught her, her voice faltering but growing stronger with each syllable. The shadows swirled around her, pressing closer, their icy tendrils grazing her skin. Desham laughed, the sound a chilling echo that rattled her resolve. You think mere words can banish me? I am eternal. I am. Amber plunged the dagger into the ground at her feet, the blade piercing the center of the ritual circle. The room erupted with light, a blinding brilliance that cut through the darkness. Desham's form writhed and twisted, his screams reverberating through the air as the shadows dissolved. When the light faded, the room was silent. The oppressive chill had lifted, replaced by an almost eerie calm. The painting was gone, reduced to a fine layer of ash that coated the floor. Amber dropped the dagger, her hands trembling as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. Is it over? Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Crane surveyed the room, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. He nodded slowly, though his expression remained cautious. For now. But Desham's spirit is powerful. He may not be truly destroyed, only weakened. Amber sank to the floor, her legs giving out beneath her. I can't go through that again. You may not have to, Crane said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. But you must be vigilant. Objects like these are rarely singular in their purpose. If there are other paintings, Amber's head snapped up. Other paintings? You mean there could be more? Crane's expression darkened. It's possible. Desham's work was vast, and if even one more survived, it could be a beacon for his spirit to return. The weight of his words settled heavily on Amber. She exchanged a glance with Sophie, who looked equally stricken. The thought of going through this ordeal again was almost too much to bear. Over the next few days, Amber worked to restore some semblance of normalcy to her life. The loft, once a space filled with creative inspiration, now felt tainted, its walls echoing with the memories of what had transpired. She couldn't bring herself to enter the loft alone, the shadows in the corners seeming to watch her every move. Sophie stayed by her side, her presence a comforting reminder that she wasn't alone in this. They decided to keep the events of that night a secret, fearing no one would believe them, or worse, that someone would seek out the remnants of Desham's work out of morbid curiosity. But late at night, when the world was quiet, Amber would wake to the faintest whisper in her ear. A voice, low and familiar, that sent shivers down her spine. I'm not finished with you yet. Amber's nights had become a torment. Despite the destruction of the cursed portrait, she couldn't shake the oppressive feeling that Desham wasn't truly gone. The whispers were faint at first, a mere tickle in the silence of her bedroom. But as days passed, they grew louder, murmurs that slithered into her mind like invasive vines. The words weren't coherent, more like fragments of sentences spoken in a language she couldn't understand. Yet the intent was clear. Desham wasn't done with her, and he wasn't alone. Amber spent her days in a daze, unable to focus on anything other than the creeping dread. Sophie had tried to convince her to leave the loft, but Amber couldn't bring herself to abandon the place she once called her sanctuary. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Amber sat alone in the dimly lit loft, sipping tea she hadn't touched. The room felt different, colder, despite the warmth of the radiator. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the walls, their edges flickering as though alive. Her phone buzzed, shattering the stillness. It was a message from Sophie. Thinking about you. Don't let the shadows win. Call me if you need anything. Amber smiled faintly at Sophie's words. Her friend's support was the only thing keeping her grounded. She typed a quick reply, thanking Sophie for her kindness, and set the phone down. The moment she turned back, she saw it. A shape in the corner of the room. Her breath caught in her throat. It was barely there, a shadow darker than the rest. It didn't move, but it didn't have to. Amber felt its presence like a physical weight pressing against her chest. Leave me alone, she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. Instead, the temperature in the room plummeted, her breath misting in the dim light. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. But Amber knew better. It wasn't over. The next day, Amber and Sophie met Crane at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. The occult expert looked more disheveled than usual. His eyes shadowed as if he hadn't slept in days. "Something's wrong," Amber blurted as soon as she sat down. "I think Desham is still here. Or, something is." Crane nodded grimly. "I've been doing some research," he said, pulling a leather-bound book from his bag and placing it on the table. The pages were filled with intricate symbols and handwritten notes. Desham wasn't just an artist, Crane explained. He was a summoner. His paintings weren't mere artworks, they were vessels. Each one was designed to trap a fragment of his soul. Destroying the portrait didn't end him. It only released part of him into this world. Amber's stomach churned. "You mean there's more of him out there? In other paintings?" Crane nodded. "It's likely. And if those paintings are still intact, they could serve as conduits for him to regain his full strength." Sophie leaned forward, her expression grave. "How do we stop him? For good this time?" Crane hesitated. "We need to find the other paintings. All of them. And we need to destroy them in a specific way. Together, during a ritual that will sever his ties to this plane." Amber felt the weight of his words settle heavily on her shoulders. She had barely survived the first encounter. How could she possibly face this again? Crane had compiled a list of potential locations where Desham other works might be hidden: private collections, obscure galleries, even estate sales. The first lead was a small antique shop just outside the city, a place Crane believed had recently acquired a Desham painting. The trio arrived at the shop late in the afternoon. The building was nondescript, its windows filled with dusty trinkets and faded furniture. A bell jingled as they stepped inside, the musty scent of aged wood and forgotten memories enveloping them. "Can I help you?" The shopkeeper, a wiry man with a hawkish nose, eyed them suspiciously from behind the counter. "We're looking for a painting," Crane said, his tone polite but firm. "An old piece, likely unsigned. It would depict something unsettling." The shopkeeper raised an eyebrow. "You're not the first to ask about that one," he said, motioning toward the back of the store. "It's in the storeroom. Came in a few weeks ago. I'll warn you, though, it gives people the creeps." "You sure you want to see it?" Amber's stomach twisted. She wasn't sure at all. But she nodded anyway. The shopkeeper led them into a cramped storeroom filled with mismatched furniture and forgotten curios. There, propped against the wall, was the painting. Amber's breath caught in her throat. The scene depicted a dense, fog-shrouded forest, its trees gnarled and twisted. At the center was a figure, a man, though his features were blurred, as if the artist had deliberately obscured them. His eyes, however, were clear, and they seemed to be looking directly at her. As Amber stared at the painting, a low hum filled the air, barely audible but impossible to ignore. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening around them. Crane muttered a curse under his breath. "It's him," he said. "This is definitely one of Desham's works." Sophie reached out, as if to touch the painting, but Crane grabbed her wrist. "Don't," he warned. "These paintings are dangerous. Even touching them can form a connection." Amber tore her gaze away from the painting, her hands trembling. "What do we do now?" Crane's expression was grim. "We take it with us. Carefully. I'll prepare the ritual, but we'll need to move fast. The longer this stays intact, the stronger he becomes." As they carried the painting out of the shop, Amber couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in the painting were following her. Watching. Waiting. That night, back in the loft, Amber dreamed of the forest from the painting. The fog was thick, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. She wandered aimlessly, the trees seeming to shift and move around her. Then she saw him, the man from the painting. He stood in the distance, his blurred features contorting into something monstrous. His voice echoed through the forest, low and menacing. "You cannot stop me," he said. "I am everywhere. I am eternal." Amber woke with a start, her heart racing. The room was dark, the shadows still and silent. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. And then she heard it. A whisper, soft and chilling, coming from the direction of the painting. Soon, Amber couldn't shake the whispers. They came and went like a sinister melody, always faint but deeply unnerving. The painting now sat in Crane's possession, locked in a makeshift containment setup he had crafted to slow Desham's growing influence. Yet, even without its physical presence, the curse felt closer than ever. The lines between dreams and reality blurred more with each passing day. Amber was haunted not only by the cursed man in the painting, but by the dark forest she had wandered through in her dream. Desham's warning echoed in her ears. "You cannot stop me. I am everywhere. I am eternal." The time for hesitation was over. Desham's threat had become too powerful to ignore, and Amber, Sophie, and Crane knew they had to act before it was too late. The trio gathered in Crane's small, cluttered apartment. The containment box holding the painting loomed ominously in the corner, its surface etched with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Crane tapped the map spread across the coffee table. "Based on the leads I've been chasing, there's another painting located in a private estate upstate. The owner is a reclusive collector named Dr. Whitaker. His house is practically a fortress." "How do we get inside?" Sophie asked, leaning forward. Crane adjusted his glasses. "Whitaker is hosting an invitation-only event this weekend. A gallery showcase of his collection. I've managed to secure invitations for all of us." Amber frowned. "Won't he notice if we walk out with one of his prized paintings?" Crane smirked, his confidence a thin veil over his own unease. "He might, but we won't give him the chance. We'll study his collection during the event, identify the painting, and return later when no one's watching." Amber's stomach churned. Sneaking into a fortified mansion to steal a cursed painting wasn't exactly something she had ever imagined herself doing. But she had no choice. None of them did. The Whitaker estate was a sprawling Gothic mansion perched on the edge of a forest. Its towering spires and arched windows gave it an almost menacing aura, and the overcast sky did little to soften its grim appearance. Amber adjusted her dress nervously as she stepped out of the car, Sophie by her side. Crane, dressed sharply for the occasion, gave them a reassuring nod. "Blend in," he whispered. "We're just here to admire the art." Inside, the mansion was just as imposing. Crystal chandeliers cast fragmented light across the polished floors, and walls were lined with paintings, each one more unsettling than the last. Guests milled about, sipping champagne and speaking in hushed tones. Amber felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise as they moved through the gallery. The air seemed heavier here, as if the mansion itself disapproved of their presence. "That's it," Crane whispered, stopping in front of a painting. The artwork depicted a crumbling chapel surrounded by gravestones. At the center of the scene was a dark figure, barely visible, yet unmistakably watching. Amber's breath hitched. She could feel the same malevolent energy that had radiated from the first painting. "We'll come back for it," Crane said, his voice low. "For now, let's leave before anyone notices." But as they turned to go, Amber froze. A figure stood in the shadows near the far wall, its face obscured. She blinked, and it was gone. Late that night, under the cover of darkness, the trio returned to the Whitaker estate. Dressed in black and armed with bolt cutters, flashlights, and a satchel for the painting, they crept toward the side entrance. Crane's research had revealed a weakness in the mansion's security. An old servant's passage that bypassed most of the alarm systems. It was their only way in. The passage was narrow and damp, the air thick with mildew. Amber shivered as she followed Crane and Sophie, their footsteps echoing faintly in the confined space. When they emerged in the gallery, the mansion was eerily silent. The grand hallways, so lively earlier that evening, now felt like the hollow corridors of a tomb. "There," Crane whispered, pointing to the cursed painting. As they approached, the air grew colder. Amber's flashlight flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. Her heart pounded as she reached for the painting, her fingers trembling. The moment she touched the frame, the house seemed to come alive. A deep, guttural groan reverberated through the walls, and the chandeliers above began to sway. "Move!" Crane shouted. Sophie grabbed the satchel, and together they slid the painting inside. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching and twisting as if trying to engulf them. Then came the whispers. They were louder this time, more insistent. Words in an ancient language Amber couldn't understand filled the air, growing in intensity with every passing second. Suddenly, a figure materialized in the center of the room. A man, his features blurred like the figures in the paintings. But his eyes burned with a fiery intensity that pinned Amber in place. "You cannot escape," the figure hissed. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Crane yanked Amber's arm, breaking the trance. "Run!" The trio sprinted through the gallery, the shadows pursuing them like living creatures. Amber could hear Sophie's labored breathing behind her and Crane's frantic commands ahead. As they reached the servants' passage, the walls began to close in, the wood groaning as if alive. They barely made it outside before the passage sealed shut with a deafening crash. Gasping for air, they tumbled into the waiting car. Crane floored the accelerator, the mansion disappearing into the darkness behind them. But the whispers followed. Back at Crane's apartment, the painting was placed in the containment box alongside the first. Crane began reinforcing the box with more runes, muttering incantations under his breath. Amber sat on the couch, her hands trembling. "That figure," she whispered. "It wasn't just Desham, was it?" Crane shook his head. "No, there's something worse. Desham may have created the paintings, but there's a larger force at work here. Something ancient and far more dangerous." Sophie frowned. "What does it want?" Crane hesitated. "Power. Chaos. Desham's soul fragments are just a means to an end. If this force regains its full strength..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That night Amber dreamed again. She was back in the forest, the fog thicker than ever. The trees seemed alive, their branches reaching for her like skeletal hands. At the center of the clearing stood the chapel from the second painting. Its doors were ajar, and a faint light spilled out. Amber approached cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Inside the chapel, she saw them, paintings, dozens of them, lining the walls. Each one depicted a scene more horrifying than the last. And at the center of the room stood Desham. "You are too late," he said, his voice echoing ominously. "The door is opening." Amber woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. The whispers were louder now, filling the room with their malevolent chorus. The curse wasn't just spreading, it was evolving. Amber's world had become a waking nightmare. The stolen paintings, now locked away in Crane's reinforced containment box, pulsed with malevolent energy. She could feel their presence even when she wasn't near them, an oppressive weight that gnawed at her mind. Crane, for all his expertise, looked increasingly haggard, and Sophie rarely smiled anymore. The curse was consuming them all, and time was running out. Desham's chilling declaration in her dream haunted Amber. "The door is opening." She didn't fully understand what it meant, but one thing was clear. If the curse wasn't stopped soon, whatever lay beyond that door would be unleashed upon the world. The morning after her nightmare, Amber sat with Crane and Sophie in the cramped living room of Crane's apartment. The containment box hummed faintly in the corner, as if mocking their attempts to control its contents. "We need to find the last painting," Crane said, his voice grim. "Without it, we can't piece together the full ritual to stop this." Amber frowned. "How do we even know where it is?" "The last two were hard enough to find." Crane rubbed his temples. "I've been researching Desham movements before he created the paintings. He visited an abandoned abbey in France, one rumored to be a site of dark rituals. If I'm right, the final painting is there." Sophie crossed her arms. "An abandoned abbey? In the middle of nowhere. Great. That doesn't sound like a death trap at all." "It's our only lead," Crane replied. "If we don't act now, we won't get another chance." The abbey, located deep in the French countryside, was a crumbling relic of another era. Its once majestic spires were now jagged ruins, and ivy crept over its stone walls like veins on a corpse. The surrounding forest was dense and silent, the kind of place that swallowed sound and light alike. The trio arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low on the horizon. Amber shivered as they approached the abbey gates, the air growing colder with every step. "This place feels wrong," she whispered. Crane nodded. Be on guard. If the painting is here, so is its curse. Inside, the abbey was even more foreboding. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor, and faded frescoes on the walls depicted angels and demons locked in eternal battle. Amber's flashlight beam swept across the room, landing on a large, ornate altar at the far end. Behind it hung a painting. There it is, Crane said, his voice trembling. The painting depicted a stormy sea, a single figure struggling to stay afloat amidst the waves. But as Amber stared at it, the water seemed to ripple, and the figure's desperate cries echoed faintly in her ears. Don't look at it too long, Crane warned, pulling a cloth from his bag. He approached the painting cautiously, covering it and carefully lifting it from the wall. As soon as the painting left its place, the abbey began to tremble. The ground beneath their feet shook violently, and a low, guttural roar echoed through the abbey. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as cracks spread across the stone walls. We need to get out of here, Sophie shouted, grabbing Amber's arm. The trio sprinted toward the exit, the painting clutched tightly in Crane's hands. But as they reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening boom. Amber turned to see shadows pooling in the center of the abbey, coalescing into a humanoid shape. The figure was tall and gaunt, its face a void of darkness save for two glowing red eyes. You dare defy me? It hissed, its voice a cacophony of whispers. You think you can stop what has already begun? Crane stepped forward, his voice shaking. We're not afraid of you, the entity laughed, a sound that chilled Amber to her core. You should be. With a flick of its hand, the shadows surged toward them, a tidal wave of darkness that swallowed everything in its path. Amber screamed as she felt icy tendrils wrap around her ankles, pulling her into the void. Amber opened her eyes to find herself back in the forest from her dreams. The fog was thicker than ever, and the trees loomed like skeletal sentinels. She was alone. Hello, she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers answered, a dissonant symphony that seemed to come from every direction at once. She turned in circles, trying to locate their source, but the fog obscured everything. Then she saw it, a faint light in the distance. It flickered like a candle, growing brighter with each step she took toward it. When she reached the clearing, she gasped. The chapel from the second painting stood before her, its doors wide open. Inside, the light burned brighter, revealing the three cursed paintings arranged in a triangle on the floor. And standing at the center was Desham. You've come far, he said, his voice calm but menacing. But this is where it ends. Amber's knees buckled, fear rooting her in place. What do you want? Desham smiled, a cruel, mocking expression. Freedom, power, to finish what I started. He raised his hand, and the paintings began to glow, their colors swirling and merging into a blinding vortex. The ground shook violently, and Amber felt herself being pulled toward the center of the triangle. Stop! She screamed, but Desham only laughed. Suddenly, a voice pierced the chaos. Amber! She turned to see Crane and Sophie running toward her, their faces pale but determined. Sophie carried a bundle of herbs, and Crane held a small, leather-bound book. We found the ritual! Crane shouted. We can stop him! Amber scrambled to her feet as Crane opened the book, chanting words in a language she didn't recognize. The painting's glow dimmed slightly, and Desham's smile faltered. No, he roared. You cannot undo what I've created. Sophie began spreading the herbs around the triangle, their scent sharp and earthy. Amber joined her, using her flashlight to guide the way. The vortex slowed, its pull weakening. Desham's form flickered, his edges blurring like a smudged painting. This isn't over, he screamed, his voice reverberating through the forest. With a final chant from Crane, the paintings erupted in a flash of light. When the brilliance faded, the forest was silent. Desham was gone, and the cursed paintings lay smoldering on the ground. Back at Crane's apartment, the trio sat in exhausted silence. The paintings, now charred and unrecognizable, were sealed in a reinforced box and buried deep beneath the city. Is it over? Amber asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Crane hesitated. For now. Sophie frowned. What do you mean, for now? Crane sighed. Desham may be gone, but the force behind him, it's still out there. And it's not done with us yet. Amber shivered, her mind flashing back to the glowing red eyes in the abbey. She knew Crane was right. The curse wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The oppressive weight of the curse had eased. But Amber, Crane, and Sophie knew it wasn't gone entirely. Despite their best efforts, the faint whispers lingered in the shadows, and the sense of being watched never left. They were living on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking. Their confrontation with Desham had been a temporary victory. Now they had to find a way to destroy the evil permanently, or risk it returning stronger than ever. 2 days after sealing the paintings, Crane received a package. It was old and weathered, the parchment-like paper yellowed with age. No return address. What is it? Amber asked as they sat around the coffee table. Crane opened the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound journal. The initials FD were embossed on the front in faded gold. François Desham, Crane whispered. The journal was filled with meticulous handwriting, the ink slightly smudged from age. Sketches of strange symbols and dark figures filled the margins. At the end of the journal was a single, ominous sentence. The final brushstroke must be undone. What does that mean? Sophie asked, leaning over Crane's shoulder. Crane flipped back through the pages, scanning for clues. Desham didn't just paint those cursed portraits. He infused them with his essence, his soul. To truly destroy them, we have to reverse the process. Undo the brushstrokes that tether him to this world. And how do we do that? Amber asked, dread curling in her stomach. Crane pointed to a series of symbols and an address scrawled on the last page. We go to where it all began. His original studio in Paris. Desham's studio was located in a decrepit building in the heart of Paris. Once a thriving hub of artistic brilliance, it now stood as a decaying relic, abandoned and forgotten. The trio entered cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the faint light streaming through cracked windows. The studio's walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, revealing faded sketches beneath. A grand easel stood in the center of the room, its surface scarred with deep scratches and burns. This is where it all started, Crane said, his voice low. Amber wandered to a nearby table cluttered with brushes, jars of dried paint, and yellowed canvases. As she touched one of the brushes, a sharp jolt ran through her hand, and she heard a faint voice whisper, "Finish it." She recoiled, clutching her hand. Did you hear that? Sophie nodded, her face pale. It's like the air here is alive. Crane opened the journal again, scanning the symbols. We need to find the ritual circle he used to bind his soul to the paintings. It should still be here. Behind a concealed door in the studio, they found it. A hidden room lined with shelves of grimoires and artifacts. The floor was covered in a faded but intricate ritual circle, its symbols pulsating faintly as if waiting to be reawakened. In the center of the circle was a pedestal, and on it rested an ornate paintbrush. Its handle was carved with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. This is it, Crane said, his voice trembling. The brush he used to create the cursed portraits. Amber felt a chill run down her spine as she approached the pedestal. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices begging, taunting, warning. What do we do with it? Sophie asked. Crane pointed to the journal. We need to use this brush to recreate his final painting, the one that binds the curse. Only then can we destroy it. But what if it backfires? Amber asked, fear knotting in her chest. What if we end up finishing his work instead? Crane hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. It's a risk we have to take. If we don't try, the curse will consume us, and everyone else it touches. Setting up the easel in the center of the ritual room, Amber took a deep breath. The cursed paintbrush felt unnaturally heavy in her hand, as if it resisted her touch. The journal contained a rough sketch of the final painting, an abstract scene of swirling darkness with a single figure at its center. Amber began to paint, her strokes guided by instinct more than conscious thought. The room grew colder with each stroke, and the whispers grew louder, more desperate. "You're bringing me back," a voice hissed, deep and guttural. Amber froze. The figure in the painting was no longer static. It moved, its dark form twisting and contorting as if trying to crawl out of the canvas. "Keep going," Crane shouted, holding the journal and chanting the counter-ritual. Symbols etched into the walls glowed faintly, reacting to his words. Amber's hand trembled as she painted, each stroke feeling like it drained her strength. The figure in the painting grew clearer, its face twisted with malice, its red eyes burning with hatred. Sophie scattered herbs around the room, their scent mixing with the acrid smell of old paint and something far fouler. "We're running out of time," she yelled as the walls trembled and cracks snaked across the ceiling. Amber dipped the brush into the black paint one last time, her heart pounding. "This is it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of whispers. She painted the final stroke. The room erupted in blinding light, forcing Amber to shield her eyes. The painting on the easel shimmered violently, the figure within writhing as if caught in a prison of its own making. Crane shouted the final words of the ritual, his voice cracking under the strain. The glowing symbols around the room blazed brighter and brighter until they burned white-hot, then exploded into fragments of light. The figure in the painting let out a blood-curdling scream as the canvas tore itself apart, the shards disintegrating into ash. The light dimmed, and an eerie silence fell over the room. Amber dropped the brush, her hand numb and trembling. "Is it over?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking. Crane inspected the remains of the canvas and the extinguished symbols. "Yes," he said, though his voice carried a note of exhaustion and uncertainty. "The curse is broken." Back in London, the trio buried the paintbrush deep beneath a concrete foundation, ensuring it would never be used again. Amber returned to her gallery, Sophie to her life as an art dealer, and Crane disappeared into his books, searching for answers to questions he hoped he'd never have to ask. Amber tried to move on, her days filled with normalcy. But at night, she dreamed of red eyes watching her from the darkness, of whispers echoing through endless corridors. One evening, as she locked up her gallery, she noticed a package on her desk, wrapped in old parchment just like the journal. Her heart sank as she approached it, dread knotting her stomach. She didn't want to open it, but her trembling hands defied her mind's protests. Inside was a small canvas, blank but for a single brushstroke of black paint. The whispers returned.